Brendan here, the Gut Whisperer. In this video, I'm going to be talking about some books and my theory about Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point. Normally, I talk about gut health and all things health, but I'm also an enthusiast for reading. Malcolm Gladwell is one of the first sort of nonfiction, educational, highly influential authors and books that I've read that I came across through one of my mentors. So I'm going to explain how this came about and explain the tipping point within the tipping point. So Malcolm Gladwell is also a Canadian Jamaican author, very, very famous. He wrote in order The Tipping Point first, and then Outliers. And then came What the Dog Saw. And then there was Blink. And then there's David and Goliath. And then there's Talking to Strangers. And then most recently, Revenge of the Tipping Point. Basically, the tipping point, Malcolm explains, he explains how things essentially go viral, or how something starts from infancy and really spreads. He talks about super spreaders and how things go from what appear to be like an overnight success. In Outliers, he talks about different types of people. There's connectors, there's outliers. I can't remember all of them. And the reason why Tipping Point did so well ultimately is because a lot of influential and affluent and educated individuals read this book, but the magic didn't necessarily come from them reading the book. The magic came from them suggesting to their communities and colleagues and mentees and students to read the book. And so this is how I came about reading Tipping Point. One of my mentors, Bruce Bowser, he brought me the attention to this book. And he said, Coatsy, if you want to read a good book, I highly recommend Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point. And the magic lies within that because I was not pursuing literature and nonfiction and personal development at that time. This book came out in... This book would not have been on my radar, as well as many, many, many hundreds of thousands of people. This book would not be on their radar. This book would be on the radar of an affluent person, someone that is in the pursuit of personal development, someone who is part of masterminds, or someone who regularly reads influential books from up-and-coming authors or highly revered authors that the general public wouldn't necessarily know about. Enter the tipping point. So my mentor, Bruce Bowser, he is an affluent individual. He's highly, highly successful. And when it comes to an individual like that, reading a book like this, it's very common. And he read it. I remember and I asked him, I said, Brucey, how did you come about the tipping point? Did someone tell you? Or did you just come about it? He said that he saw it on, I can't remember what list it was, and he also correlated it to Malcolm being Canadian, and he said that there's a relationship or a connection with Mark McCoy, who is a Canadian Olympian, and so that's how that happened. But again, the magic doesn't necessarily happen when an affluent individual reads a book like this, because again, it's on their radar. And it's almost assumed that an individual like that, a CEO, for example, would read a book like this. How many thousands of CEOs are there in Canada, for example? There's a lot, but not a lot at the same time. But there's a whole lot more of people of lower status, social economic status than CEOs. And so Bruce, being the affluent authority that he is, he told me to read this book. And that's where the magic happens, because individuals like myself and people who have mentors, they want to be like them. They want to become successful like them. And so anything that an authority or a mentor or a teacher says, it's like gold. And so that's what's so powerful with the tipping point, because there's a tipping point within the tipping point. And this mentor told me to read this book. This book would not have been on my radar. And so I read it. And it really changed my perspective on reading. It changed my perspective on statistics, sociology, how people work and how trends happen. In the tipping point, he talks about hush puppies, for example, and how hush puppies were a very, very basic and plain, even kind of like an ugly looking boot. But there was specific moments in time and people who saw the boots at the right time, at the right moment. And that led to a tipping point where all of a sudden hush puppies became a household name amongst the whole world with regards to shoes. And so that's just one little example. Another mentor who I asked, who's also a very, very affluent woman, I asked her the same thing. I said, hey, have you read Tipping Point? And she said, of course I've read Tipping Point. And she said, I am part of a mastermind as well as sort of a book group. And she is on the hunt of reading personal development books so that she can incorporate the teachings into her business. She is like a Forbes 500, just alpha female. When she read Tipping Point, she made it a point to hand this off to 4,000 members in her community, in her group of other entrepreneurs and business leaders. And so one person, she recommended it to 4,000 people. And then that's where the tipping point comes in. So it's really, really fascinating. So I'm sharing this with you because maybe you've not read this book. Maybe you've never even heard of Malcolm Gladwell. If you are on the hunt of personal development, if you like statistics, if you like thinking about things differently, if you like learning and hearing a story within a story, Malcolm Gladwell is so talented. And this book review is probably doing him poorly justice because I'm not an affluent type of individual. I am, however, a reading enthusiast. I love books. And I didn't realize how much I love statistics. And Malcolm does an incredible job at finding statistical stats and putting them and marrying them into, or weaving them into a story within a story. So this is the original book, Tipping Point, and then it goes to Outliers, which is also incredible. I don't know where the book is. I think I've lent it out. Maybe my mom has it. And then again, it goes to What the Dog Saw, and then Blink, and then Talking to Strangers, and then most recently, Revenge of the Tipping Point. Then there's David and Goliath. I think I already said that. So if you like reading, I would highly recommend starting with the Tipping Point and then going to Outliers and then going to David and Goliath and then What the Dog Saw and then Blink and then Revenge of the Tipping Point. He's a Canadian, incredible author. I cannot emphasize how much I thoroughly enjoyed and continue to enjoy his teachings. This book, Revenge of the Tipping Point, I read it in just like, I don't know, 2-3 days, pretty quick. What's really interesting about this one, talking about super spreaders, is he actually discussed COVID, and it really changed my perspective and the whole narrative when it came to understanding how COVID became a pandemic, a global pandemic. And when he explains what happened, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. It really allows the reader to use their imagination, but at the same time, read a narrative that has a methodical process, and there's a story within a story. And he really, like I said, weaves in some really, really cool stories. He talks about in Revenge of the Tipping Point, how in Miami, there was a series of bank robbers or robberies. And he explains what the tipping point, how did it happen? This one, he talks about the wildfire of the opioid crisis and how so many people are overdosing. And he explains that it's not a plethora of prescribing doctors. He says it's super spreaders of a very, very small number of doctors that have a massive, massive influence. In Tipping Point, the original one, he talks, I think, about how bad cops, how a few small bad cops and repeating bad cops put a bad name for all police officers, sort of thing. So anyways, I just wanted to hop on here and share this with you because I thoroughly enjoy Malcolm Gladwell's work. He's a Canadian, and I love reading, and every one of his books that I've read, I've thoroughly enjoyed. So if you like to read, and if you've never heard of Malcolm Gladwell, I strongly recommend reading his books. It'll change your life. I almost say that it's kind of like going to the Mecca, or it's kind of like a rite of passage. If you are in the pursuit of intellectual readings, reading a book from Malcolm Gladwell, it's kind of like a rite of passage, I think. So I highly recommend it. And I'll put the book's links here on Amazon, and you can get them and read them. All that being said, share this with someone. Who knows, maybe even Malcolm Gladwell would see this. Kind of cool. Gut Whisperer out.